You. So our first speaker is Liliana Riga. She's a researcher at the Department of Sociology in the University of Edinburgh, and she's going to speak about Max Weber and the analysis of biography. So Liliana, whenever you want.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I suppose the first thing to say is that I'm going to say a few things about the actual content of what this research was. This research project finished a few years ago, and it began as a dissertation project, so I'm hoping that some of that is of interest to some of the students here. And it's on a topic that nobody is interested in, which is the Bolsheviks and the Russian Revolution. So you're guaranteed not to be interested in my topic. But watch what I did with it. Okay, so my project, and just briefly to say what it was, it offered I was one of these really eccentric PhD students who didn't do everything that anybody else did. So it offered a reconceptualization of the Russian Revolution, really through an interpretive documentary account of the ethnic marginalities and experiences of 93 Bolsheviks, the leadership of the Russian Revolution, who I lived with for a long time. My husband is relieved that we don't live with them anymore, but today they're back. I found, and this was my central argument really, that the revolution was led by assimilating but excluded outsiders from across the Russian Empire, and that their universalist politics, that is the politics that made the revolution, was ethnically constituted. So I found that nearly 2/3 of the Russian revolutionary leadership were non-Russian, were actually minorities from across the empire. In other words, it began to problematize the entire category of what is a Russian revolution when the leadership is not ethnically Russian. So Bolshevism was really a story about the social world that expressed the political costs of empire, the social dislocations and political exclusions that enabled certain kinds of reinventions. And I say this because it'll make sense when I go through the documents. It was the experience was a quasi-assimilated way of being in the world that generated its own kind of alienation. Historical documentary analysis, which is what I'm going to talk about, allowed me to tell a story that did not separate the history of their ideas from the history of the persons who embodied them. So it fused the ideas and the embodiment of the individuals who carried these ideas. It was a search for what Weber called elective affinities, really between ideas and people's material individual lives, mediated, but by what I will be referring to as expressive constitutive documentary analysis. So I have no text on any of my slides, so if you want to write expressive constitutive, this is the moment. There's no text on these slides, they're all visual. So the basis of this was a reinterpretation, a particular approach to documentary analysis of autobiographies. And I'm focusing here on autobiographies. These autobiographies were written, for these 93 people wrote autobiographies. They were written in a particular moment, a particular historical moment, just after the revolution, but before the Stalinist repression, so in a particular historical moment. And I'm not really interested in that, and I'll say why in a minute. They were ignored by most scholars. They were available since the early 1920s and ignored by everyone, partly because no one thought that they could provide anything. And on the face of it, actually, their content is rather bland and rather flat. So before I say what I did, let me say what I didn't do. And I say this sort of in light of some of the other talks that are coming the rest of the day. It's not content analysis. It wasn't an account of the materiality or the life of the autobiographical document. I was not interested in their discursive significance. I wasn't interested in a realist or literal reading of the documents as simply reflecting a social reality. And I wasn't interested in textual or intertextual analysis. And I wasn't interested in the archival constructedness of the documents. All of these things are very true and very important, but they didn't interest me. So what's left, you ask? So my analysis involved what I'm calling the document as expressive constitutive, as both expressive of a particular lived experience and constitutive of that experience. In other words, I'm drawing a parallel between looking at documents and a philosophy of language, document as language. Yeah? And this fundamentally means interpretation, Weberian interpretation, Verstehen sociology. And so what I want to show you, and I'll show it to you actually more than talk about it, is a kind of layered documentary interpretation. So the question that guided me was, how can we use documents, how can we use autobiographies to interpret individual internal landscapes, that is, interior worlds, right? Or interior geographies, in the context of the external landscapes or the external geographies, right, that can shape both social thought and ideas, as much as they can shape the possibilities of expressing these social thought and ideas. That is to say, how can we combine an account of the larger forces that impact individual lives, and individual radicalizations in my case, with a deeper and richer and more textured elaboration of the diverse ways in which the more intimate contexts valorize these wider forces. So it's going from the intimate to the very wider, and from the wider to the very intimate. So how does this relationship get understood? I tried to access this through autobiographies. In other words, at the core of this sort of intimate lives and wider social processes, I situated the autobiography. So I wanted to read these documents as expressive constitutive of what I call radically contextualized or radically embedded, and what you would call situated knowledges. Each one would be one. So instead of saying what I did, I'll just show you an example of how I did it. And that way you can find lots of things wrong with it. So I started out with this in my head. This is a painting by Chagall. And at the beginning of the research, this is how I viewed my project. Total chaos, confusion, a lot of activity, 93 people, a huge empire, a revolution, and no idea of how to access this or make sense of it. So I had this picture in my wall throughout my dissertation process, and now it's on the cover of the book, which is my own secret pleasure. I'll show you how I got from this to an account. As in the Latin phrase, solvitur ambulando, the problem is solved by walking, right? So we just start doing it, right? So I began with this image. And what I wanted to do was use historical documents, biographies, to unpack this. So I started with one individual, and I'll just give you one example. And you can't make this out. This is the autobiography, Maniulski. So he's a Ukrainian Bolshevik, and he wrote. This is the first page, and this is the rest of it here with all of my scribbles and translations, because my Russian was not very good in the early parts of archival research. It took a long time. And so this became sort of I needed to take this and embed it in a social world, embed it in some kind of social context. So I started to read this. And one of the things with a kind of empathetic imagination, or the sociological imagination that we talk about in using in sociology, and I tried to enter his world. So I would put myself in the descriptions that he was talking about, right, to see where this could go. So So one thing that I noticed, especially in him, but then it started to repeat itself, and I'll just talk about one individual, but then you can imagine this over 93 people, was that he got arrested a lot. Revolutionaries in Imperial Russia got arrested a lot. They spent often more time in prisons and getting out of prison than they did revolutionizing. And he was arrested 8 times. And in his account, he talks about them quite matter of fact. And so I got arrested again, and I was in prison for. And this struck me as a way of, okay, well, I need to follow this, right? This is something to think about. So I went to the Tsarist police records. So this is his police, one of his police records. He has a huge file, not as big as others, but he has a huge file. So this is one of his police records. And so I started to layer his biography with another document. So it started to get a layer to it, right? I started to embed it in this way. And I noticed in reading the police records, the way that the Tsarist government, the Russian state, empire, kept police records, one of the more important things that they put on all of them was their ethnicity or their religion. So it became clear that this was a way of grasping the population. This is what the state was thinking in the way they were grasping the population, because this was an important fact to put into their police records. And then I went back to the document, right? And he talked about it too. Right? So this started to become an interesting way to layer the biography, layer the autobiography. So I thought, well, what does this mean? And so I went to the Imperial Census. So this was the 1897 census that the Russian Empire conducted of the Ukraine. Right? And this is now a way, a third layer. So there's the biography, the autobiography, and then there's the police records. And then now it's the Imperial Census. So here I started to get a sense of, okay, so he's from here. So what does it look like here? To start to contextualize some of the things that I was reading in his biography. But he also talked about the village or the town that he was from. So this wasn't giving me enough depth, right? So he talked about names and places. I noticed the locatedness of his ideas, of his radicalization, of his politicization. Ideas don't just float in the air, right? They were highly located. So I started to look, this is in the census, I went to the city where he was from. And here you get the ethnic breakdown, the class breakdown, the geographical breakdown. I could locate his neighborhood. It's like Google Maps on steroids historically, right? I could locate him. Right? And that started to contextualize this even more. It started to embed this and layer this even more. Right? I went through this for 93 revolutionaries. So 93 people, I would start to follow the same things. Right? And I have to say that at this point, I still didn't have an argument. I still didn't have a thesis. I had a really worried supervisor. But then I thought, well, I need to embed this in a different way. Instead of taking his autobiography and going this way, right, I also need to layer it up. So abstract layering it up. So I thought, well, how can I do that? And so I thought, well, this is it. This is the ethnic map of Imperial Russia, and the little diamond triangles are the Bolsheviks, are my people. They're still my people. And this was a way then of taking this account and starting to embed it in layers this way, right? Not just this way. And I realized that ethnically diverse complexity could produce relevant social experiences. This was new. No one had said this before. No one had assembled data in this way before, despite 70 years of work on the Russian Revolution. And I started to look at shared dimensions of experience. In other words, I had a whole bunch of these. And so I started to look at shared dimensions of these experiences rather than just as individuals, right? So it was I thought, well, now this is a geographical layering. So now, in order to build even further this way, I now need an analytical layering. So this is it. This is Imperial Strategies, This is my masterpiece here. This is Imperial Strategies of Exclusion and Integration. In other words, all of these people, right, their stories fit in here. In other words, I started to look at policies. I started to look at their father's occupations. I started to look at other things and embed that autobiography in this way, layer it in this way. So really, what I want to say is that these three things, these three images, are all images of exactly the same thing. These are three representations of exactly the same thing in my mind. When I see this, I also see that, and I also see that. Right? And the way to access this, the way that this is all accessed, is through an expressive, constitutive interpretation of the document, of the autobiography. Right? Interpreting autobiographies, reading them as situated knowledges, allows you to think about it in this particular way. So it's not reading a document literally, but interpretively. It's viewed as thinking about it as you would view language, right? You can view language as instrumental, which is fine and which is useful, but it's less helpful than viewing it as expressive of particular phenomenological experiences, and also expressive of particular constitutive experiences. So it's about layering it in a kind of radical contextualization. This is what is the basis of all of these kinds of representations. And this is what I understand to be Weberian interpretive, or Verstehen sociology, a radical contextualization of phenomenological experience, right, accessed through this kind of document analysis.
Thank you very much. So, well, Liliana did great timekeeping, so we've got time for some questions or comments for her. Better, yeah. Yes, please.
I also like the Russian Revolution from when I was at school and we studied it, so I'm one of you.
Not too many of us.
How did you choose the 93? Were there more people with biographies, or were these the only 93 that had biographies?
They didn't all have this kind of autobiography. A lot of them had biographies, not all of them had autobiographies. I chose the leadership of the revolution between 1917 and 1924.
Right.
In other words, I began with that as my data set. Right?
Okay,
So it was the people who made this revolution.
You started with
Central Committee leadership.
Right. Just a list.
Very mundane, right? So it took a while to sort of say, well, who made it? How do I know who made it? It's not just going to be three people, Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky. It's going to be more people because, right? So I just went through the Central Committee leadership over the years, over the first, until Lenin's death. Before then, a new phase started.
Was there anybody that you looked at that there was little written about?
Yes. So some of them were very extensive, had lots of stuff, wrote a lot. Some of them barely wrote anything, and there was very little on them. So I separated the dissertation, the chapters, by ethnic group. So a chapter on the Ukrainians, a chapter on the Latvians, a chapter on the Jews, a chapter on the Russians, right? And they're uneven, right? So the chapter on the Poles and Lithuanians focuses on three people in real depth. The chapter on the Russians had, 33 Russians. So that couldn't have treated them in the same way that I could three people in depth, right? So it treated them in a different way. Yeah. But my hope was that, and I think I did it, is that over the course of the variations in presenting that data, a collective biography emerges, right? So unevenly, but a collective biography emerges. Right? And I kind of began with the individuals, but then I started to try to find kind of shared experiences, you know? So you start to say, well, gosh, exclusion, these guys are kind of pissed off about being arrested for that, you know? And so you would find things that were shared dimensions of experience.
Mike.
Thank you. Really, really fascinating. Maybe a silly question, but what makes someone a leader? So they're listed, but what sort of activities?
I did a very, very kind of unimaginatively. So I took the central committee leadership. I took the people who were central committee of every year for these 5 years.
I just mean what did...
And so how they got to
yeah.
the central committee was a matter of internal Bolshevik politics, which
Yeah.
didn't really interest me. Right? What interested me was who they were, but not how they necessarily got there. Yeah.
Richard.
Lily, did you look at interactions between them, who knew each other and when? Because, I mean, we think revolution of everything surely is a group process, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you've got these biographies, autobiographies, this kind of individualizing research process. And then you find commonalities across the group. But I'd love to know who was talking to who met who radicalized who.
Yeah. So yeah, I did that. I mean, it wasn't. They weren't sort of hermetically sealed.
No, clearly they weren't.
So some of it was there were individual connections. There were people who joined up with groups together. But there were also people who were radicalized and sort of politicized up until the very end, up until 1917, in isolated parts of the empire. So in Georgia, someone would be their entire political career in Georgia until 1917, in which case then they would go to the capital. So it depended on the groups that they were in, the connections between the groups. I didn't bring it obviously, but I have a big, on my wall I had this big chart, and it sort of put all their relationships and all the groups and the movement within groups and whatnot. So I did do that. But I started this.
The interesting thing is that the logic of your method seems to imply, it's been quite radical, but actually it's individual biographies, it's the structural preconditions for those biographies that actually really matter, rather than what you might think of how a cell met together, talked together, strategized.
Yeah, because in effect, I mean, I approach this as a phenomenologist, right? So I'm interested in the essence of the experience of becoming a revolutionary.
Right.
So I began it that way. Yeah, I know.
The point, I might only realize I'm a revolutionary by talking about the revolutionaries.
Sure, but you get that in the course of understanding. Yeah.